I married the girl my entire family rejected, and called a nobody the wedding. 5 years later, she walked back into that same room, and nobody the table could even look her in the eye. The day I married Emma, people didn't congratulate me. They laughed. Some whispered that I had ruined my future. Others looked at me with pity, as if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. They said she wasn't beautiful enough, wasn't rich enough, and wasn't the kind of woman a successful man should marry. 5 years later, those same people stood in silence, staring at her with disbelief. Some even wished they could go back in time and take back every cruel word they had ever spoken. But by then, it was far too late. I want to tell you the whole thing, start to finish, not the polished version people repeat at dinner parties years later, but the real one. The version with the ugly comments, the years of struggle, the secret that nearly tore it all apart before it ever had the chance to become something worth telling. Because I think there's a version of this story happening quietly in 1,000 other households right now, some person being told they're settling, some partner being reduced to a single, visible flaw by people who never once bothered to look any further. If you're that person, or if you love that person, I want you to hear how this one actually ended, before you let anyone else's small imagination decide what you deserve. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I work as a software engineer for a growing technology company. My life has always been simple. I never cared much about expensive cars, designer clothes, or impressing strangers. I believed that character mattered more than appearance. Maybe that's because my parents raised me that way before they passed away when I was 23. Losing them changed me forever. It taught me that people can disappear in a single moment, but kindness stays in people's hearts long after they're gone. I should say more about who they were, because I don't think anything that happened later makes sense without understanding the two people who shaped me first. My father, Walter Carter, worked 31 years as a shop teacher at the same public high school. The kind of man who could fix anything with his hands and never once raised his voice, not even when I wrecked his car at 17. My mother, Diane, taught piano lessons out of our living room for extra income, and I grew up falling asleep most nights to the sound of some nervous 9-year-old fumbling through scales in the next room. They died within 8 months of each other. My father first, a heart attack in the garage while he was rebuilding a lawnmower engine for a neighbor who couldn't afford a new one, and then my mother, who the doctors said technically died of a stroke but who I've always privately believed, simply couldn't find a reason to keep going without him. I was 23, a year out of college, still learning how to be an adult, and suddenly I had no one left to call when something good or something terrible happened. Rachel, 4 years older than me, tried to step into that role. She meant well. She has always meant well. But there's a difference between a sister trying to parent you out of love, and two parents who actually built the floor you stand on. And I think some of what happened later, the whole ugly mess with Emma, traces back to Rachel trying to fill shoes that were never built for her, and getting the fit badly wrong. There's one memory of my father I return to more than almost any other, and it feels important to include here, because I think it explains something essential about who I became. I was maybe 15, helping him in the garage on a Saturday, when a man from 2 streets over came by asking if my father could look at a bicycle his daughter had gotten for her birthday, already rusting and squeaking after only a few months. The man was embarrassed, clearly not well off, apologizing for bothering us with something so small. My father spent 2 hours on that bicycle, refused any payment beyond a plate of cookies the man's wife brought over afterward, and once the man had gone, he turned to me and said something I've never forgotten. "Rowan," he told me, using an old nickname he had for me that no one else ever used. "It doesn't cost you anything to notice when somebody needs help, and it costs you everything if you get in the habit of not noticing." I didn't understand, at 15, how directly that lesson would end up shaping the rest of my life. I understand it completely now. Emma Collins was 2008 when I first met her. She worked at the city's public library. She loved books more than social media, preferred quiet afternoons over loud parties, and always smiled at people, even when life gave her reasons not to. She wasn't the kind of woman who would stop traffic when she walked into a room. She had a small scar across her left cheek from a childhood accident. It wasn't very noticeable, but in today's world, where everyone is obsessed with perfection, that tiny scar became the first thing people judged. She'd told me once, much later, about the interview that finally got her the library job. The one position out of nearly 30 applications she'd sent out that actually resulted in a callback. The head librarian at the time, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Frances, who retired not long after I started visiting, had looked over Emma's resume, glanced up at her face for exactly as long as it takes to make eye contact and no longer, and asked her a single question that had nothing to do with the scar at all: "What's the last book that made you cry, and why?" Emma had talked for 10 straight minutes, she told me, more animated than she'd been in any interview before or since, and Frances hired her on the spot. "It's the first job I ever had," Emma said, "where nobody once mentioned my face during the entire process. I think that's part of why I loved it there so much, even before I loved anything else about my life yet." The first time I saw Emma, she was sitting alone in a corner of the library, reading a novel. A little boy accidentally knocked over a stack of books. Instead of getting annoyed, she laughed softly, helped him pick everything up, and even found the book he had been searching for. I checked out a book that day, even though I had no intention of reading it. I just wanted an excuse to talk to her again. Over the next few weeks, I found myself visiting the library more often than necessary. We talked about books, movies, childhood memories, and dreams. Unlike most conversations I had with other people, talking to Emma never felt forced. Hours passed like minutes. I remember the third or fourth visit clearly, because it was the first time she really let her guard down. I'd asked her, half joking, what the strangest book request she'd ever gotten was, expecting a funny library anecdote. Instead, she told me about a regular patron, an elderly man named Mr. Ostrowski, who came in every week asking for large print romance novels for his wife, who had gone blind 2 years earlier from macular degeneration. He couldn't read them to her fast enough on his own, so Emma had started setting aside 20 minutes every Thursday afternoon to read a chapter aloud to him. Over the reference desk, quietly, so as not to disturb anyone, just so he'd have material fresh enough to bring home and read to his wife himself that evening. She told me this like it was nothing, like it wasn't remarkable at all, and I remember sitting there thinking that I had never met anyone who gave away that much of herself, without expecting anything back. Mr. Ostrowski's wife passed away the year before our wedding, and he stopped coming into the branch after that, the reference desk visits ending as quietly as they'd begun. Emma mailed him a card anyway, and a small watercolor she'd painted specifically for him, a portrait of the two of them reading together that she'd worked from a photograph he'd once shown her. He wrote back a single handwritten line that Emma kept, along with everything else that mattered to her, tucked into that same shoebox in our closet. "You made the last 2 years of her life feel less dark than they were." That's more than most people manage in a lifetime. One rainy evening, as the library was closing, I offered to walk her to the bus stop. "You don't have to," she said with a shy smile. "I know," I replied. "I want to." That short walk changed everything. She told me about her childhood, about the accident that left the scar on her face, and about how kids at school called her names for years. She told me the specific details that evening, standing under the bus shelter while rain drummed on the plastic roof above us. In a voice so matter-of-fact it took me a moment to understand how much it must have cost her to say it that plainly. She'd been 9, riding her bike home from a friend's house on a wet afternoon much like this one, when her front tire caught the edge of a storm grate, and she went over the handlebars onto the pavement. The scar came from the concrete, not from anything more dramatic than bad luck and bad timing, but by the time she started 4th grade that fall, stitched and healing, a group of girls in her class had already decided the mark on her face made her strange, contagious somehow, someone to be avoided rather than befriended. She told me about eating lunch alone for most of that year, about a birthday party in 5th grade she wasn't invited to specifically because, as one girl had told her with the brutal honesty only children manage, "My mom said your face might scare the little kids." She told me all of this without a trace of self-pity, like she was reciting facts about someone else's life rather than her own. And I remember standing there in the rain thinking that the saddest part wasn't the cruelty of 9-year-olds, children can be cruel and grow out of it, but that so many of the adults around her, teachers, other parents, had simply let it happen without ever once stepping in. She admitted that she had stopped believing anyone could truly love her. "I've learned not to expect much from people," she whispered. I looked at her and said something that surprised even me. "Maybe you've just been surrounded by the wrong people." She didn't answer. She simply smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried years of hidden pain. Over the following weeks, before either of us had put a name to what was happening between us, I found small, deliberate reasons to spend time with her outside the library. I offered to help her carry a donation box of old paperbacks to a used bookstore on a Saturday. A task that took 20 minutes and somehow stretched into a 4-hour afternoon of wandering the store's aisles, arguing cheerfully about which forgotten novels deserved to be rediscovered. I invited her to a free outdoor screening of an old black-and-white film in a park near her apartment, and we sat on a blanket I'd borrowed from my sister without explaining why I needed it, close enough that our shoulders touched, neither of us quite brave enough yet to close the remaining distance. She invited me, in turn, to a tiny, unglamorous bakery near her building that made cinnamon rolls the size of a dinner plate, and told me, with the first real, unguarded laugh I'd heard from her, that she'd been coming there alone every Sunday morning for years, and that I was the first person she'd ever brought with her. 3 months later, we were officially dating. For me, falling in love with Emma was easy. For everyone else, accepting her was impossible. The first person to object was my older sister Rachel. I've thought a great deal in the years since about why Rachel reacted the way she did, and I don't think the honest answer is simple cruelty, even though it felt that way at the time. Rachel had spent her 20s and early 30s building a very specific kind of life. A marketing director role at a well-known firm, a husband who came from money, a social circle, where appearances were treated as a kind of currency. The sort of world where who you brought to a dinner party said almost as much about you as anything you actually accomplished yourself. She'd also, quietly, spent those same years believing she'd failed our parents somehow, by not being the one who kept the family together after they died, since I was the one who'd ended up handling most of the estate, most of the difficult phone calls, most of the practical grief. I think some deep, unexamined part of her wanted my marriage, my life, to reflect well on the family in a way that could make up for whatever she believed she owed our parents' memory. Emma, unglamorous, unconnected, visibly marked by an old childhood accident, didn't fit that picture, and Rachel's fear wasn't really about Emma at all. It was about a version of our shared grief she'd never fully worked through. I understand that now. I didn't understand it then. Sitting across from her at that Sunday dinner, only feeling the sting of her disapproval. She invited me to dinner one Sunday afternoon. "So," she said while stirring her coffee, "I've heard about this new girlfriend." I smiled. "Her name is Emma." Rachel nodded slowly. "I saw her pictures." "And?" She hesitated. "I think you can do better." The room suddenly felt colder. "What does that mean?" "I mean, Daniel, you're successful. You're handsome. You could date anyone." "I already found someone." She sighed. "People will judge you." I leaned back in my chair. "They're already judging her." Rachel looked away without saying another word. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, my coworkers invited me to lunch, the kind of standing Friday tradition our small engineering team had kept up for years, usually spent talking about nothing more consequential than weekend plans and whatever project was currently on fire. Someone asked to see a picture of Emma. I proudly showed them. The table became unusually quiet. Then, one man laughed. "Seriously?" Another shook his head. "I thought you were joking." A woman across the table smiled awkwardly. "Personality matters, I guess." I forced a smile, but inside, something broke. Not because they insulted me. Because they had reduced the kindest woman I had ever met to nothing more than her appearance. I should name the man who laughed, because he reappears later in this story in a way I genuinely didn't expect. His name was Marcus Feld, a senior engineer on the payments team, a few years older than me, the kind of confident, loud presence every office seems to have. Someone whose opinion carried more weight in a room than it probably should have, simply because he said things with total certainty. Marcus didn't just laugh that day. He kept going, in the easy, careless way of a man who'd never once considered that words might actually cost someone something. "Man," he said, shaking his head and passing the phone to the woman beside him. "You're a catch, Daniel. You could have had anyone. I'm just saying, this feels like you're settling." The woman beside him, whose name was Priya, glanced at the photo, then glanced at me, and said nothing at all, which at the time felt almost like its own small kindness compared to everyone else at that table. That evening, Emma noticed I was unusually quiet. "What happened?" She asked. Nothing. She smiled gently. Daniel, you're a terrible liar. I laughed. Then I told her everything, word for word, watching her face carefully for some sign of the hurt I was certain was coming. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the particular way I'd come to recognize as her bracing for something. When I finished, she looked out the apartment window for a long moment, at the gray evening light settling over the rooftops, before she finally spoke. I'm used to it. Those 4 words hurt more than every insult I'd heard that day. Nobody should ever become used to being treated like they don't matter. I took her hand. They don't know who you are. She squeezed my fingers. Maybe they never will. 6 months later, I asked Emma to marry me. There were no fireworks, no expensive restaurant. I'd planned it, in my own quiet way, for almost a month by then. I knew a proposal at some upscale restaurant downtown, the kind with a string quartet and a surprise photographer hiding behind a potted plant, would have made Emma miserable, rather than happy. She'd told me once in passing, that she hated the feeling of being watched during anything that actually mattered to her, a habit built from years of being stared at for the wrong reasons. So instead, I asked her, casually, if she wanted to drive out to the coast one Saturday, just the 2 of us, no explanation given. She said yes without hesitation, the way she said yes to almost anything that meant more time together and less time around other people. We picked a stretch of beach south of the city, mostly deserted on a chilly Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of gray, wind-scoured coastline that Seattle locals learn to love, rather than merely tolerate. We walked for almost an hour before I finally worked up the nerve, collecting smooth stones along the tide line the way we always did, Emma narrating an increasingly elaborate and entirely fictional backstory for each one, a habit of hers that never once failed to make me laugh. No cameras, just the 2 of us, sitting on a quiet beach at sunset. I don't have the perfect ring, I admitted. It had belonged to my mother, a modest ring with a small, slightly off-center diamond that my father had saved for 8 months to afford back when he was 24 and working his first year as a shop teacher. I'd kept it in a drawer since the estate was settled, unsure for a long time whether I'd ever find someone I wanted to give it to. Sitting there on the cooling sand, watching the sun drop toward the water, I finally understood why I'd waited. I don't need a perfect ring, she whispered. I don't have a perfect life. I don't want a perfect life. I smiled nervously. Will you marry me? Tears filled her eyes before she even answered. Yes. She hugged me so tightly that for a moment, it felt like the entire world had disappeared. Just the 2 of us, and the sound of the waves, and the last of the light fading over the water. We stayed on that beach long after the sun had fully set, sitting wrapped in the single blanket I'd thought to bring. Neither of us in any hurry to drive back to a world that hadn't yet found a reason to celebrate with us. I thought the hardest part was over. I had no idea the real battle was just beginning. The news of our engagement spread through our families faster than I expected. At first, I thought people would eventually come around. I believed that once they spent time with Emma, they would see what I saw. I couldn't have been more wrong. My mother wasn't alive to meet Emma, and there were days when I wished she were. She had always taught me that the heart of a person mattered more than anything else. I often wondered what she would have said if she had been sitting beside me through everything that followed. Rachel offered to organize our engagement dinner. I took it as a sign that maybe she was trying to accept Emma. Instead, it became one of the most painful nights of our lives. The restaurant was beautiful, filled with warm lights and soft music. Emma wore a simple navy blue dress she had bought on sale because she didn't like spending money on herself. You look beautiful, I whispered as we walked inside. She smiled nervously. I hope your family likes me. I kissed her forehead. They will. The moment we reached the table, I realized I had been lying to both of us. The table itself was arranged for 12. Rachel and her husband, my uncle and his second wife, 3 cousins and their partners. A family friend of my mother's who'd insisted on coming despite barely knowing me as an adult, and Emma and me at the far end, seated. I noticed with a small sinking feeling, almost as an afterthought, closer to the kitchen doors than to the rest of the family. Rachel had planned the seating chart herself. I've never asked her whether that particular arrangement was intentional. I've never wanted to know the answer badly enough to ask. Rachel barely looked at Emma. My uncle kept asking me about my career instead of speaking to my fiancée. One cousin stared at Emma's scar for several uncomfortable seconds, before finally saying, "So, what exactly happened to your face?" The entire table went silent. Emma answered politely, "I was in a bicycle accident when I was 9. "Oh," he replied. "That's unfortunate." Then he changed the subject, as if nothing had happened, but everything had happened. Not everyone at that table behaved that way, and I think it's important I say so, because it would be too easy, looking back, to paint the entire family as uniformly cruel, when the truth was messier than that. My father's younger sister, Aunt Carol, a retired nurse who rarely said much at family gatherings, had been sitting quietly near the end of the table the whole evening. After the cousin's question about Emma's face, in the awkward silence that followed, Carol was the one who spoke next, addressing Emma directly for the first time all night. "I had a boy in my unit years ago," she said, "a burn patient, maybe 19 years old, who used to say the people who stared the longest were never the ones who ended up mattering. He was right about that. It wasn't a grand gesture, not compared to what came later from Rachel. But it was the only kind word spoken at that entire dinner. And Emma told me afterward, in the car, that she'd held on to that single sentence the whole drive home, turning it over like a small stone in her pocket. I watched Emma quietly lower her eyes to her plate. Later that evening, while she stepped outside to answer a phone call, Rachel leaned toward me. "You still have time to change your mind." I stared at her. "What did you just say?" "I'm serious. Marriage is forever. So is treating people with respect." She sighed. "I'm only trying to protect you." "No," I said calmly. "You're trying to protect your image." The conversation ended there. But the damage had already been done. On the drive home, Emma remained unusually quiet. "I'm sorry," I finally said. "For what?" "My family." She looked out the window. "They don't owe me kindness." "They do." She smiled sadly. "I've spent my whole life waiting for people to choose kindness. Have stopped expecting it." That sentence stayed with me for days. A month before our wedding, something happened that neither of us expected. Emma resigned from her job at the library. I was shocked. "You loved working there." "I did. So why leave?" She hesitated, twisting the hem of her sweater in her hands, the way she did whenever she was working up the nerve to say something difficult. "The new manager thinks visitors feel more comfortable when someone more presentable is at the front desk." For several seconds, I couldn't even speak. "Did he actually say that?" She nodded. "He said it politely." I clenched my fists. "That's discrimination." She shrugged, with a painful smile. "Sometimes discrimination wears a friendly face." That night, I barely slept. I wanted to confront the manager. I wanted to report him. Emma stopped me. "Please don't." "But it's not fair." "I know, so why let him get away with it?" She took my hand. "Because I don't want my life to be controlled by people who don't deserve my energy." I had never met anyone stronger than Emma. Not because she never cried, but because she refused to let bitterness define her. I want to be honest about something I've never said publicly before. Not even in the version of this story I sometimes tell friends. That week, after Emma quit the library, I did something I'm not entirely proud of. I drove to the branch on my lunch break, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to work up the nerve to walk in and confront the manager myself, a man named Perry Caulfield, who I'd met exactly twice at library fundraisers Emma had dragged me to. I got as far as the front doors before I stopped myself, hand on the glass, and thought about what Emma had actually asked of me. She hadn't asked me to fix it. She'd asked me to let her decide how to carry it. I turned around and drove back to work without going in, and it took me a long time afterward to understand that walking away that day wasn't weakness. It was the first real lesson Emma taught me about what it actually means to support someone, instead of just wanting to rescue them. There's a small postscript to that particular chapter that Emma only told me about years later, after the gala, once she'd finally found enough distance from it to laugh a little. Perry Caulfield, it turned out, was quietly let go from the branch about 18 months after Emma resigned, following an unrelated complaint from a different employee about similar comments made to a patron in a wheelchair. Emma heard about it secondhand from a former colleague who still worked there, and she told me she felt almost nothing when she heard the news. Not vindication, not satisfaction, just a strange, quiet indifference, as though the version of herself who had once needed that particular reckoning had already healed past the point of needing it. That, more than anything, told me how far she'd come. Our wedding day finally arrived. It was small, simple, exactly what we wanted. We held the ceremony in a small botanical garden outside the city, chosen mostly because Emma had once told me, early in our dating, that it was the one place in Seattle where she'd never once felt stared at, since everyone who visited was too busy looking at the flowers. Fewer than 40 guests attended, a number that had shrunk considerably from the guest list Rachel had originally drafted for us, back before Emma and I quietly decided we'd rather have a handful of people who genuinely wanted to be there than a room full of acquaintances performing enthusiasm they didn't feel. Emma wore her grandmother's old wedding dress, altered slightly to fit her, a modest ivory gown from the 1970s that Evelyn had kept preserved in a cedar chest for exactly this purpose, though she'd never lived to see the day it was finally worn again. I wore my father's cufflinks, the only piece of him I still carried on my body regularly. Small silver ovals, engraved with his initials that had sat in a drawer since his funeral. We wrote our own vows, short ones, neither of us being especially gifted with public speaking. I promised her, simply, that I would spend the rest of my life making sure she never again had to wonder whether she was worth choosing. She promised me that she would spend the rest of hers learning, slowly, to believe him, meaning me, without needing daily proof. Or at least, what we thought we wanted. As guests arrived, I noticed people whispering. Some looked at Emma with curiosity, others with judgment. A few didn't even try to hide it. During the reception, Marcus, the same co-worker who had laughed at Emma's photo months earlier, approached me, holding a glass of champagne. He laughed quietly. "I still can't believe you actually went through with it." I looked him straight in the eye. "Went through with what?" "This." He casually pointed toward Emma. "You could have married someone different." I felt anger rising inside me. Instead of arguing, I asked him one question. "What do you know about her?" He blinked. What do you actually know about Emma?" He couldn't answer. Because he knew nothing. Nothing about the little girl who survived years of bullying. Nothing about the woman who secretly volunteered every Saturday at the Children's Reading Center. Nothing about the evenings she spent reading stories to elderly patients at a local care home, simply because they felt lonely. Nothing about the fact that she donated part of every paycheck to buy books for children whose families couldn't afford them. He had judged her entire worth after looking at her face for less than 5 seconds. That wasn't intelligence. That was prejudice. I should mention because it says something about the kind of quiet good Emma did that almost no one ever witnessed. That the Children's Reading Center she volunteered at wasn't some polished nonprofit with a marketing budget and a newsletter. It operated out of the basement of a Lutheran church 2 bus transfers from our apartment. Run almost entirely by a retired teacher named Ruth Alvarez, who kept the whole operation going on donated paperbacks and her own modest pension. Emma had been going there every Saturday morning for nearly 3 years by the time I met her. Reading to kids whose parents worked weekend shifts, and had nowhere else to leave them. And she never once mentioned it to me, until I noticed a stack of battered picture books in her tote bag, and asked what they were for. Even then she undersold it completely, calling it just something I do sometimes, as if 3 consecutive years of unpaid Saturday mornings were a minor hobby, rather than the load-bearing kindness of an entire small community. Ruth had started that program almost 15 years earlier, after retiring from 30 years teaching elementary school, because she'd noticed too many children in the neighborhood spending their Saturdays unsupervised, while parents worked weekend shifts at the warehouse 2 miles away. She ran it entirely alone for the first several years, using her own retirement savings to buy books when donations ran short, until Emma showed up one Saturday as a shy 19-year-old, having seen a handwritten flyer taped to a bus stop, and simply never stopped coming back. Ruth told me once, at the grand opening of the renovated Evelyn Room years later, that Emma had been the single most consistent volunteer she'd ever had in 15 years of running the program, never once missing a Saturday except for the week Evelyn passed away, and even then, Ruth said, Emma had called ahead to make sure another volunteer covered her spot rather than letting the kids simply show up to an empty room. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Emma and I stood alone in the empty reception hall. The music had stopped. The lights were beginning to dim. She slipped off her shoes and laughed softly. "My feet are killing me." I laughed too. "Worth it?" She looked around the quiet room. Absolutely. Then she became serious. Daniel? Yeah. What if they're right? I frowned. Who? Everyone. What do you mean? What if one day you wake up and realize you deserve someone prettier? Someone everyone would admire? I gently lifted her chin until she looked into my eyes. Emma. She tried to smile, but tears were already forming. I held both of her hands. The day I stop choosing you, I paused, will be the day I stop being myself, she cried. Not because she doubted me, but because nobody had ever loved her enough to erase the lies the world had repeated to her for years. We couldn't afford much of a honeymoon, not with a wedding budget already stretched thin, but we drove up the coast for 4 days afterward, staying in a small rented cabin with a wood stove that Emma insisted on lighting herself every evening, refusing my help with a stubbornness I'd come to recognize and love. We spent most mornings walking the tide pools, most afternoons reading in silence on a porch that faced the water, and most evenings simply talking, the way we had that very first rainy night at the bus stop, as if we still had years of getting to know each other left to do, which, in a sense, we did. On our last night there, sitting by the fire, Emma told me she'd never once, in her entire adult life, felt as completely unguarded around another person as she did in that small cabin. I don't feel like I need to brace for anything here, she said. I didn't know what that felt like, until you. As we left that cabin, and drove back toward the life waiting for us in Seattle, neither of us realized that life was about to test our marriage in ways we had never imagined. Because only 3 months after our wedding, a single phone call would change everything, and begin the journey that would leave the same people who mocked Emma completely speechless 5 years later. 3 months after our wedding, my phone rang at 6:17 on a cold Monday morning. I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. Hello? Is this Daniel Carter? Yes. My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm calling from Evergreen Memorial Hospital. The moment I heard the word hospital, my heart dropped. Is Emma okay? There was a brief pause. Your wife is fine, Mr. Carter. But her grandmother was admitted during the night. She keeps asking for Emma. Within 20 minutes, we were driving through heavy rain toward the hospital. Emma barely spoke. Her grandmother, Evelyn, had raised her after the accident that left the scar on her face. She wasn't just family. She was the person who had taught Emma how to survive, when the rest of the world kept telling her she wasn't enough. I should explain, because Emma rarely talked about it in detail even with me, exactly why her grandmother had raised her in the first place. Emma's parents divorced when she was 6, and after the accident that left the scar 3 years later, something in her mother seemed to quietly give up on the whole project of parenting. Emma described it once, flatly, without self-pity, as her mother deciding that a daughter with a visible flaw was somehow a reflection of her own failure, and slowly withdrawing until Evelyn, Emma's paternal grandmother, simply stepped in and never stepped back out. Evelyn raised her from 10 years old onward in a small house 2 towns over, on a retired schoolteacher's pension, and never once, in 18 years, made Emma feel like a burden she'd been handed. It was Evelyn who taught her to paint, buying her a beginner's watercolor set for her 12th birthday, because Emma had come home from school in tears after a classmate mocked her scar, and Evelyn had told her, "Painting doesn't care what your face looks like, Emma. It only cares what your hands can do." Emma kept that watercolor set, dried out pans and all, in a shoebox in our closet for the rest of her life. There was a second person, beyond her grandmother, who mattered enormously to Emma's artistic development, though she rarely spoke of her by the time I met her, and I only learned the full story years into our marriage. Her name was Mrs. Kellerman, Emma's high school art teacher, one of the very few adults in that building who ever treated Emma as anything other than the quiet girl with the scar. Mrs. Kellerman kept Emma after class twice a week during her junior year, not for detention, but for what she called extra studio time, quietly recognizing a talent that Emma herself was too beaten down by then to trust. She entered one of Emma's charcoal portraits into a regional student art competition, without telling her. And when it won second place in the entire district, Mrs. Kellerman drove 40 minutes to Emma's house that same evening, ribbon in hand, because Emma hadn't even bothered attending the ceremony, certain there was no reason to. "You didn't even show up to see if you'd won," Mrs. Kellerman had said, standing on Evelyn's porch, according to the story Emma eventually told me. "Do you know why?" Because some part of you already decided you didn't deserve to be there. Emma, I need you to hear me. You have a gift most people spend their whole lives searching for, and never find. Don't let anyone, including yourself, talk you out of using it. Emma kept that ribbon too, folded carefully into the same shoebox as the dried-out watercolor set. Mrs. Kellerman retired the year after Emma graduated, and, as far as either of us ever learned, moved out of state to be closer to her own grandchildren. Emma tried, more than once over the years, to track her down, wanting simply to tell her what had finally become of the girl she'd once driven 40 minutes out of her way to encourage. She never managed to find a working address. I think in a strange way, that unfinished thread is one of the only genuine regrets Emma still carries from that whole chapter of her life. Not the bullying, not her mother's absence, but the fact that the one teacher who saw her clearly never got the chance to see how right she'd been. When we entered the hospital room, Evelyn smiled weakly. There you are, my beautiful girl. Beautiful. I noticed something. Her grandmother had never once looked at the scar. She only looked into Emma's eyes. Emma hugged her carefully. I'm here. For the next hour, I stayed near the window while they talked quietly. They laughed about old memories. They cried about difficult years. Then Evelyn asked me to step outside for a moment. I assumed she wanted privacy. 10 minutes later, Emma came out with tears streaming down her face. What's wrong? She couldn't answer. She simply hugged me. Later that evening, she finally spoke. My grandmother doesn't have much time. I held her hand all night. A week later, Evelyn passed away peacefully. The funeral was small, simple, just the way she had wanted. After everyone left the cemetery, Emma remained standing beside the grave. I feel like I'm alone now, she whispered. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. No. She looked at me. You still have me. She nodded. But grief has a strange way of making people feel empty, even when they're surrounded by love. The following weeks became the hardest period of our marriage. Emma stopped laughing. She barely ate. I found myself, during those weeks, thinking constantly about my own parents, about the strange, unfair math of grief. How losing my mother and father 8 months apart had taught me things about loss that I now needed to draw on to help Emma through hers, and how inadequate that preparation somehow still felt. I remembered, in particular, the weeks after my father's funeral, when my mother had stopped playing piano entirely, the instruments sitting untouched in our living room for nearly 2 months, silent in a way that felt louder than any music ever had. I hadn't known, at 23, how to help her back to the piano bench. I only knew that eventually, on her own timeline, she'd sat back down one evening and played something soft and unfinished. And that had been the first sign she might survive losing him. I held on to that memory during Emma's silence, reminding myself that grief moves at its own pace, and that the only thing I could actually control was staying close enough that she'd have somewhere to land whenever she was ready. She quit painting, something she had loved since childhood. Every evening, she sat quietly on the balcony watching the sunset, without saying a word, wrapped in one of my old sweatshirts that had long since stopped smelling like me, and started smelling only like her. One night, I found an old sketchbook hidden in our closet, tucked behind a box of winter clothes she hadn't touched since spring. Inside were dozens of breathtaking portraits. Children, families, old couples holding hands. Every drawing was filled with emotion. I stared at them in disbelief. Emma. She looked embarrassed. They're not very good. I almost laughed. Not good? She shrugged. I've never shown them to anyone. Why? Because people would probably laugh. That sentence broke my heart. The world had criticized her for so many years that she no longer trusted her own talent. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I carefully photographed several of her paintings. Without telling her, I uploaded them to a small online art community. I chose the community carefully, actually. A moderated forum a college friend had mentioned once, known for being unusually kind and constructive compared to the more competitive corners of the internet, populated mostly by hobbyist painters, and a handful of working artists who genuinely enjoyed encouraging newcomers, rather than tearing them down. I picked 6 photographs, the ones that had stopped me cold when I first found the sketchbook. A portrait of an elderly man with weathered hands folded in his lap, A young girl mid-laugh with her eyes crinkled shut. An elderly couple sitting on a porch swing, not touching but somehow radiating decades of quiet companionship anyway. I wrote a short caption. Nothing dramatic, just that these were the work of my wife, who didn't yet believe they were good enough to show anyone. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed beside her, half convinced I'd made a mistake, half hoping I hadn't. I expected nothing. Maybe a few encouraging comments. Instead, by evening, thousands of people had shared her artwork. Comments flooded in from strangers around the world. This is incredible. The emotion in these paintings is unbelievable. Who is the artist? I would buy this immediately. I stared at the screen in complete shock, refreshing the page every few minutes, watching the number of shares climb steadily through the afternoon while Emma slept, entirely unaware that her life was quietly changing while she rested. When Emma woke up, I handed her my phone. She looked confused. Then she started reading. Her hands began to shake. "These," she whispered, "they're talking about my paintings." "They are. They actually like them." I smiled. "They love them." For the first time since her grandmother died, she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave strangers. Not the smile she used to hide pain. A real smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes and stayed there. Over the next few months, something incredible began to happen. Small art collectors started contacting us. Then local cafes asked to display her paintings. One of those cafes, a small independent coffee shop near our apartment called Marlowe's, hung 4 of Emma's prints on its exposed brick wall and, within a month, told us they'd had more customers asking about the artist than about the coffee itself. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Desmond, who'd emigrated from Trinidad 15 years earlier and built the shop from nothing, refused to let us pay him anything for the wall space, insisting instead that Emma sign a small card beside each print with her name and a short note about the subject. "People like knowing there's a real person behind the work," he told her. "It makes the coffee taste better too, somehow, though I couldn't tell you why." Those 4 prints stayed on Desmond's wall for years afterward, long after Emma's paintings were selling in Portland and San Francisco and New York because Emma refused to ever take them down. It was the first place, she told me once, where strangers looked at her work instead of her face, and she wanted that reminded to her every time she walked in for a cup of coffee. Soon, one gallery invited her to participate in a community exhibition. Emma almost said no. "I'm not good enough." I took both of her hands. "You've spent your whole life listening to people who underestimated you." She looked at me silently. "It's time you listen to someone who believes in you." She agreed. The exhibition wasn't glamorous. The morning of the exhibition, Emma changed her outfit 4 times, which was unlike her. She'd never once, in all the years I'd known her, cared much about clothes. I found her standing in front of the closet, holding 2 nearly identical blouses, her hands trembling slightly. "It doesn't matter what I wear," she said, more to herself than to me. "They're going to look at my face before they look at the paintings anyway." I didn't argue with her, because I understood by then that no reassurance from me could undo 18 years of conditioning in a single morning. I just told her that whatever she wore, I'd be standing beside her the entire evening, and that if anyone looked at her face instead of her work, I'd make sure they eventually looked at the work too. It was held in a modest downtown gallery with white walls and soft jazz music. Emma stood nervously beside her paintings while visitors walked past. For nearly an hour, nobody stopped. I could see doubt returning to her face. Then an elderly woman paused in front of one portrait. She stood there for several minutes, without speaking. Finally, she turned toward Emma. "Did you paint this?" Emma nodded nervously. "Yes." The woman wiped away a tear. "This reminds me of my late husband." She bought the painting immediately. Her name, we learned later when she came back to introduce herself properly, was Josephine Atta, a retired shipbuilder's widow in her late 70s. That single portrait, of an elderly man's weathered hands folded in his lap, wasn't just a striking image to her. She told Emma, quietly, that her husband had worked with his hands for 40 years at the shipyard, and that after he passed, she'd struggled to find a single photograph that captured them the way she remembered. Not stiff, just resting the way they always had at the end of a long day. She became, over the following years, one of Emma's most loyal collectors, eventually commissioning 2 more pieces and, without either of us ever asking her to. Quietly telling every friend in her retirement community about the young artist she'd discovered at a small gallery show. Word of mouth from a widow in her 70s, it turned out, was worth more to Emma's early career than any advertisement we could have paid for. Then another visitor bought a second one. By the end of the evening, every single painting had been sold. Emma couldn't believe it. Neither could I. As we drove home that night, she kept looking out the window. "I don't understand." "What? Why now?" I smiled. "Because talent doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right people to notice." She leaned her head against my shoulder. For the first time in years, she wasn't seeing herself through the eyes of those who rejected her. She was finally beginning to see herself the way I always had. But neither of us knew that someone else had also noticed her success. Someone from my past. Someone who had once laughed at our marriage. And that person was about to return, with a secret that would threaten everything we had built together. A few weeks after Emma's first successful exhibition, life finally felt peaceful. For the first time since we'd met, I saw her waking up with excitement instead of anxiety. She spent hours in the small studio we had built in our garage, surrounded by paintbrushes, unfinished canvases, and classical music playing softly in the background. Every painting she created seemed to carry a piece of her soul. I often stood quietly at the doorway, watching her work. She never noticed me, and I loved that. Because those were the moments when she was completely herself. One Friday afternoon, my assistant walked into my office holding a white envelope. "This was delivered by hand," she said. There was no return address. I opened it. Inside was an invitation to the Pacific Northwest Contemporary Art Gala, one of the most prestigious art events in Seattle. Emma had been invited as a featured emerging artist. I couldn't believe it. But before that invitation ever arrived, something else happened that I've never fully told anyone outside my closest friends, because for a while it genuinely threatened to unravel everything Emma had just started to build. 2 weeks after the sold-out exhibition, I got a call at my office from a name I hadn't heard in almost 7 years. Vivian Marsh. Vivian and I had dated for a year and a half in my mid-20s, before my parents died, before Emma, before I understood much of anything about what actually mattered in another person. It had ended badly. She'd wanted a version of me that prioritized climbing, networking, being seen at the right restaurants, and I simply wasn't built that way, even back then. We hadn't spoken since. Somehow, in the years since, she'd built a career as a freelance art consultant, the kind of person who circles gallery openings, advising wealthy collectors on what to buy. And it turned out she'd been at that first community exhibition, standing quietly at the back of the room, watching Emma's paintings sell out one by one. "Daniel," she said, her voice smooth and unreadable over the phone. "I heard you got married. Congratulations." I kept my answer short. "Thank you, Vivian. What can I do for you?" "I saw your wife's paintings." She paused, just a beat too long. "They're good. Really good. Almost suspiciously good for someone who's never shown anywhere before." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, even before she finished the sentence. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that one of the portraits looked remarkably similar in composition and palette to a series by an artist named Corinne Delacroix, who showed at a gallery in Portland about 4 years ago." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Daniel. I'm just telling you what people in the industry are already starting to whisper." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt since the day of our engagement dinner. I told myself it was nothing, some petty jealousy dressed up as professional concern. But a small, ugly seed of doubt had already been planted, and 2 days later it began to grow into something much larger and far more public. An anonymous post appeared on a regional art forum, comparing 3 of Emma's paintings side by side with 3 works by the same obscure Portland artist Vivian had mentioned. The compositions weren't identical, not even close if you actually studied them, but there were surface similarities. A particular way of rendering hands, a recurring use of warm amber light, the kind of loose visual echo that exists between almost any 2 portrait painters working in a similar emotional register. But posted without context, stripped of nuance, framed as an accusation instead of an observation, it spread through the small regional art community within days. By the time Olivia Bennett called me directly, her voice tight with concern, The story had already reached 2 local arts bloggers. "Daniel," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. Has Emma ever seen Corinne Delacroix's work before? Studied it, referenced it, taken a workshop where her paintings were used as examples?" I honestly didn't know the answer, and admitting that terrified me more than anything else that week. I drove home that evening and found Emma in the garage studio, staring at her own painting with an expression I hadn't seen since before her grandmother died, that old familiar posture of a woman bracing for the world to tell her she wasn't enough. "You saw it," I said quietly. She nodded, not looking up from the canvas. "Everyone's seen it, Daniel. It's everywhere now." I sat down beside her on the paint-splattered stool, and asked her the same question Olivia had asked me. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me something I hadn't known. Years earlier, during a rough stretch after her grandmother's first minor stroke, before I'd ever met her, Emma had taken a single free weekend painting workshop at a community college extension program, taught by a visiting instructor, who used a rotating slideshow of contemporary regional artists as inspiration examples. She couldn't even remember most of the names shown that day. "It was entirely possible," she admitted, her voice shaking, "that Corinne Delacroix's work had been one of dozens of slides flashed across a projector screen for 30 seconds each, years before Emma ever picked up a brush seriously again after her grandmother's death." "That's not stealing, Emma," I said. "That's just how art works. Everyone who's ever painted anything learned from someone else's brushstrokes first. Try telling that to a room full of strangers on the internet," she said, pulling her knees up to her chest on the paint-splattered stool, looking, for a moment, exactly like the frightened 19-year-old she must have been on her very first Saturday at Ruth Alvarez's reading center, unsure whether the world had any room in it for her at all. We didn't sleep that night. Early the next morning, I did something I'm not proud of in the moment, but have never once regretted since. I called Vivian directly and asked her point blank whether she had posted the comparison herself or fed it to someone else who had. She denied it for almost 10 minutes, cool and composed, until I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the anonymous account that posted the images had used a stock photo profile picture that I recognized, because Vivian had used the exact same photo on a consulting website she'd built 2 years earlier and forgotten to fully scrub from a cached search result. The line went silent for a long moment. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I saw her at that exhibition, sitting there so nervous, and then everyone was talking about how incredible she was, and I don't know, Daniel. I just wanted people to ask a question instead of just handing her everything." "That's not a question, Vivian," I said. "That's sabotage with a nicer word attached to it." "Nobody handed her anything," I added, my voice hard in a way I rarely let it get. "She spent 18 years building the ability to survive people exactly like the one you tried to be this week. You didn't expose anything, Vivian. You just proved you were still the same person you were 7 years ago, except now you had a bigger audience to be cruel in front of." She agreed, eventually, to post a follow-up under her own name, acknowledging that the similarities were superficial at best, that she had no actual evidence of any wrongdoing, and that she regretted allowing an unfounded observation to spread as if it were established fact. It wasn't a full retraction, not really, and the damage lingered in certain corners of the local art scene for months. But Olivia Bennett, to her enormous credit, released her own statement the same week, calling the accusation baseless and reaffirming her full representation of Emma's work. And Corinne Delacroix herself, when a reporter finally tracked her down for comments, said simply that she'd never heard of Emma Collins Carter before that week, and saw nothing in the paintings beyond 2 artists, independently exploring warm light and quiet human moments, which, she pointed out dryly, described roughly half the portrait painters working in the Pacific Northwest. Emma cried the night the whole thing finally died down. Not from relief exactly, but from something closer to exhaustion. "I keep thinking," she told me, "that the second something good happens to me, someone shows up to take it apart." I held her for a long time before I answered. "Then, let them keep showing up," I finally said. "And let them keep failing. Because you're not going anywhere, Emma, neither am I." I never told her the full extent of what Vivian had done, not the stock photo, not the phone call, not any of it, beyond the basic fact that an old acquaintance of mine had spread something untrue out of jealousy. Some truths, I decided, were mine to carry. So Emma didn't have to carry them too. It was the first time I understood, really understood, what her grandmother must have felt every single day, quietly absorbing the world's cruelty so the person she loved wouldn't have to bear its full weight alone. I heard from Vivian exactly once more, almost 2 years later, a short, unprompted email that arrived out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd left the art consulting business entirely by then, she wrote, and had gone back to school for counseling, something about wanting work that didn't reward her for the parts of herself she wasn't proud of anymore. She didn't ask for anything in the email, didn't ask me to pass along an apology to Emma, or seek any kind of absolution. She simply wrote that she thought about that phone call more often than she'd like to admit, and wanted me to know, for whatever it was worth after so much time, that she was trying to become a different kind of person than the one who'd made it. I read the email twice, didn't respond, and didn't mention it to Emma either. Some things I've learned are simply meant to be witnessed, rather than answered. 3 weeks later, the invitation to the Pacific Northwest Contemporary Art Gala arrived, and for a moment I let myself hope that the worst of it was finally truly behind us. When I showed her the invitation that evening, she laughed. "This has to be a mistake." "It isn't. There are hundreds of talented artists, and you're one of them." She stared at the invitation for a long time before quietly saying, "I'm scared." I smiled. "So am I." She looked surprised. "Really? Every time you take a step toward your dream, I'm afraid someone will try to convince you that you don't deserve it." She hugged me tightly. "Thank you for never believing them." The night of the gala arrived. Emma wore a simple emerald green dress, one she'd found on her own at a small consignment shop rather than let me buy her something new and expensive, insisting the dress didn't need a designer label to do its job. She insisted on styling her own hair. She covered her scar with nothing. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't even try. "You forgot your makeup," I teased gently. She smiled. "No." I finally stopped hiding. I looked at her for several seconds, taking in the whole of her, unguarded and steady in a way I'd watched her grow into slowly over years rather than all at once. She had never looked more beautiful. We arrived at the venue, a restored Art Deco theater downtown that had been converted into an event space years earlier. Its lobby lined with marble and gold leaf that seemed to belong to an entirely different world than the one Emma and I had built together in a modest apartment on the north side of the city. Valets in black vests took cars as expensive as small houses. A red carpet, genuinely red, genuinely rolled out for the occasion, led up a short flight of stone steps toward the entrance. By a line of photographers whose cameras flashed at every car that pulled up, checking each arriving face against some mental list of who mattered enough to photograph. I felt Emma's hand tighten in mine as we stepped out of the car. "I can turn around right now," I told her quietly, only half joking. "We can go get cheeseburgers instead, and never think about any of this again." She laughed, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Don't tempt me," she said. Then she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin in a way I recognized from 100 smaller battles she'd already fought and won, and walked with me up those stone steps into the noise and light. When we entered the ballroom, photographers surrounded famous artists, collectors, and business leaders. No one recognized Emma. At least, not yet. As guests walked through the exhibition, I noticed people slowing down in front of her paintings. One after another, whispers spread across the room. "Who painted this? The emotion is unbelievable. I've never seen work like this." Then, something unexpected happened. A well-known gallery owner walked directly toward Emma. "My name is Olivia Bennett." Emma smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you." Olivia extended her hand. "I'd like to represent you." Emma froze. "I'm sorry, what?" "I believe your work belongs in galleries across the country." For several seconds, Emma couldn't even speak. I squeezed her hand. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. This was the moment she'd spent her entire life believing would never come. But the evening wasn't over. I learned more about Olivia over the years that followed. Enough to understand why she'd recognized something in Emma's work that so many others at that exhibition, wandering past with champagne in hand, had simply glanced at and moved on from. Olivia had started her own gallery career after walking away from a much larger, more prestigious firm downtown, frustrated by what she once described to us over dinner as an industry that too often confused connections for talent and pedigree for genuine skill. She'd built her small independent gallery specifically to represent artists other firms overlooked. Self-taught painters, older artists starting late, people without the right degree or the right last name opening the right doors. Emma, she told us once, wasn't a charity case or a feel-good story to her. She was simply, in Olivia's professional judgment, one of the most naturally gifted portraitists she'd encountered in over a decade of doing this work. And the fact that nobody else in the industry had noticed yet was their failure of attention, not evidence of anything lacking in Emma herself. We signed the actual representation contract 2 weeks after the gala, sitting in Olivia's small book-lined office above her gallery space, sunlight cutting through dusty blinds onto a coffee table stacked with catalogs from artists whose careers she'd helped build over the years. Emma read every line of the contract twice before signing. The same careful, methodical attention she used to bring to notarizing documents in her old life, and Olivia waited patiently through both readings without a hint of impatience. "You don't have to rush this," Olivia told her. "I'd rather you feel completely certain than feel pressured into a decision you're not ready for." Emma looked up from the contract, pen finally in hand. "I've spent my whole life being told I should feel grateful for whatever attention I got," she said. "I want to make sure this is something I actually choose, not something I'm just relieved somebody's finally offering me." Olivia smiled, the same warm, unhurried smile I'd come to associate with her over the following years. "That," she said, "is exactly the answer that tells me I picked the right artist to fight for." Across the ballroom, I recognized a familiar face. Rachel, my sister. She hadn't spoken to us in nearly a year. The estrangement hadn't come from one single dramatic fight, but from a slow accumulation of missed holidays and unreturned calls after the engagement dinner and the wedding, the kind of quiet rift that forms not from hatred, but from two people no longer knowing how to be in a room together. I hadn't invited her to the gala. I later learned, from a mutual cousin, that she'd heard about Emma's exhibition through a coworker who'd attended one of the sold-out shows and had bought her own ticket to the gala without telling either of us, unsure until the moment she walked through the doors whether she'd actually have the courage to approach us at all. Now she was standing only a few feet away, staring at Emma's paintings. She slowly walked toward us. For a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, she whispered to me. Emma smiled politely. "Hello, Rachel." Rachel looked down at the floor. "I owe you an apology." Emma remained silent. "I judged you before I ever knew you." Tears filled Rachel's eyes. "I thought I was protecting my brother." She looked directly at Emma. "But the truth is, I was protecting my own pride." Emma gently nodded. "I appreciate you saying that." Rachel's voice trembled. "I don't expect forgiveness." Emma answered with the same kindness that had always amazed me. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It gives us a chance to build something better." Rachel broke down crying. She hugged Emma. I stood there for a moment, watching my sister and my wife embrace in the middle of a crowded ballroom, and felt something in my own chest finally loosen that I hadn't realized had been clenched tight for years. "I love you," Rachel said to Emma, still crying, the words coming out clumsy and sudden. "I don't even really know you yet, not the way I should, but I already love you, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to let myself." Watching them, I realized something. Kindness had accomplished what anger never could, but fate still had one more surprise waiting for us. Aunt Carol found us not long after Rachel did, having driven 2 hours from her retirement community specifically because she'd heard, through some branch of the family grapevine, that Emma's paintings would be on display that night. She moved slower than she used to, leaning on a cane she hadn't needed the last time I'd seen her, but her eyes were as sharp as ever when she took Emma's hands in both of hers. "I remembered you," she said simply. "From that dinner, years ago. I've thought about you since, more than you'd probably guess." Emma smiled. "I remembered you too," she said. "You were the only kind thing said at that whole table." Carol shook her head slowly. "Kindness is cheap when it's the only thing being offered," she said. What you've built here, that took something else entirely. I'm proud to know you, Emma. I hope you know that. Later that evening, the host stepped onto the stage, a well-known local news anchor who moonlighted as an MC for charity events across the city. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to announce the winner of this year's People's Choice Award, voted on by every guest in attendance tonight based on the single work that moved them most. Emma squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. She whispered, "I'm not going to win. There are actual famous artists here tonight, Daniel. People who've been doing this for decades." I smiled. "You already have." The presenter opened the envelope, and for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath along with us. "The winner is..." A long pause filled the room. The kind of theatrical pause event hosts love and nervous nominees hate. Emma Collins Carter. The ballroom erupted into applause. Emma stood frozen. She looked around, as if they had called the wrong name. I leaned closer and whispered, "They're talking about you." She slowly walked toward the stage, her emerald dress catching the light, her scar entirely visible under the bright stage lighting for the first time all evening, and I watched 300 strangers rise to their feet for a woman who, 5 years earlier, couldn't get a library manager to let her work the front desk. As she accepted the award, every person in the audience stood to applaud, including people who had ignored her only hours earlier. The cameras flashed non-stop. The same woman who had once been rejected because of a small scar was now the most celebrated artist in the room. When Emma began her acceptance speech, the entire ballroom became silent. She stood at the podium for a long moment before speaking, gripping the small glass award with both hands, and I could see her visibly gathering the courage to say something she hadn't fully planned in advance. I recognized that particular stillness in her. The same stillness she'd had standing at the reference desk all those years ago, about to explain something she'd never told anyone before. She smiled through tears. "When I was a little girl, I believed being different meant I would never belong." She paused. "For many years, I believed the voices that told me I wasn't enough." Then she looked directly at me. But one person looked at me, and saw everything the world refused to see. The audience turned toward me. "I wouldn't be standing here tonight without my husband." My eyes filled with tears. She continued, "This award doesn't belong only to me. It belongs to every person who has ever been rejected because they looked different, and every person who chose kindness instead of judgment." The applause lasted nearly a full minute. As we walked out of the ballroom that night, reporters rushed toward Emma. The same society that had once ignored her now wanted interviews, photographs, and headlines. That gala took place almost 3 years after our wedding, and I want to be honest that the story didn't simply end there in a single triumphant night, the way these things sometimes get told afterward. Real life kept moving, messier and slower than any ballroom speech. And it's the 2 years that followed the gala, I think, that actually deliver on everything that first agonizing year had promised to take from us. Olivia Bennett's gallery representation turned into something neither of us had dared imagine that first uncertain evening. Within a year, Emma had a solo show in Portland, then another in San Francisco, then a small but genuinely prestigious feature in a group exhibition in New York that we flew to together, holding hands through JFK, like two people who still couldn't quite believe any of it was real. She never stopped being nervous before an opening. I don't think that particular fear ever fully leaves a person who spent their whole childhood being told they weren't enough. But she stopped letting the fear make her decisions. And that, more than any single sale or headline, was the actual transformation I watched happen in her over those 2 years. The Portland show almost didn't happen the way it was supposed to. 3 days before the opening, a well-regarded art critic for a regional paper published an early preview piece that, while largely positive, included a single condescending line describing Emma's work as remarkably accomplished for someone with no formal training. Emma read it standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd once read her mother's letter, and I watched her jaw tighten in a way that told me the old wound, the one about never being enough, had been reopened by a single careless phrase. "They always find a way to put an asterisk on it," she said quietly, setting the paper down. "Remarkable. But talented. But I'm so tired of the but, Daniel." I sat with her at the table, and reminded her of something Olivia had told us both months earlier, during contract negotiations. Almost in passing, half the working artists Olivia represented, painters with decades of formal training and prestigious MFA programs behind them, had never once sold out an opening the way Emma's very first show had. "Training teaches technique," Olivia had said. "It doesn't teach whatever it is your wife has, and frankly, I've represented a great many technically superior painters who couldn't move a room the way she does." That, I reminded Emma, was the actual expert opinion in the room. A critic's condescending aside in a preview piece was noise. Olivia's confidence, built on genuine professional judgment, rather than a headline deadline, was signal. Emma went to that Portland opening anyway, chin up, and it became, at the time, her most successful show yet. The same critic who'd written the condescending preview attended in person, and, to his credit, published a full follow-up review a week later, walking back his earlier framing almost entirely, describing her work simply as some of the most emotionally direct portraiture he'd encountered in years, formal training or not. Emma kept both clippings, the condescending one and the corrected one, in a folder in her studio, not out of bitterness, she told me, but as a reminder that first impressions, even professional ones, are rarely the final word. She used part of the proceeds from her second solo show to do something I don't think anyone who knew her growing up would have expected, though I wasn't surprised at all. She bought the building that housed Ruth Alvarez's basement reading center, the one she'd volunteered at every Saturday morning for years before I ever met her, and quietly funded a full renovation. Real shelving, proper lighting, a small art corner with donated supplies for any child who wanted to draw instead of read that particular Saturday. She named it, simply, the Evelyn Room, after her grandmother. And she made sure the plaque by the door said only that, no mention of Emma Collins Carter anywhere on it. Ruth cried the day she saw the finished space. Emma cried harder. She still shows up most Saturday mornings, even now, even with a growing career that could easily fill every single hour of her week with more lucrative demands. I went with her once, quietly, standing near the back of the room while she sat cross-legged on the floor among a dozen kids, sketchbooks open, showing a shy 9-year-old named Marisol how to shade the curve of an apple using nothing but the side of a charcoal stick. Marisol had a cleft lip scar, faint but visible, and I watched Emma notice it within the first 5 minutes, the way she noticed everything about a child's particular vulnerabilities, and gently, without ever making it obvious, spend a little extra time at Marisol's table that morning. "You always sit with the kids who need it most first," I said to her afterward, once the room had emptied out and we were stacking chairs together. Emma shrugged, folding a stray piece of drawing paper in half. "I know what it feels like to sit in the back of a room hoping nobody looks at you too closely," she said. "If I can be the one person in a kid's week who looks at them the right way, instead of the wrong way, that's worth more to me than any gallery sale. The paintings pay the bills, Daniel. This is the actual work." Marisol still comes to the Evelyn Room most Saturdays. Older now, more confident, and Emma tells me she's become one of the most talented young artists to pass through the program in years, filling entire sketchbooks with drawings she brings back proudly each week to show off. Ruth mentioned once that Marisol had told the other kids, with the total unself-conscious confidence of a child who's finally been shown she's allowed to have it, that she was going to be a famous painter someday, just like Miss Emma. Emma cried a little when Ruth told her that, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from watching a wound you once carried get quietly, deliberately, prevented from forming in someone else. I didn't have anything to add to that. I never do, on the mornings I go with her. I just help stack the chairs. One more encounter from that period deserves telling, because it closes a loop that had been open since long before I ever met Emma. About 6 months after the Portland show, Emma received a friend request and a long rambling message through her newly created public artist page from a woman named Kayla Denton. Emma stared at the name for a long moment before showing me the message. "That's her," Emma said quietly. "From 4th grade. The birthday party." Kayla's message was 3 paragraphs of nervous, over-explained apology, the kind people write when they've clearly rehearsed it many times before finally hitting send. She said she'd seen an article about Emma's gala win shared in a local parenting group, recognized the name immediately, and had spent an entire evening scrolling through old memories she'd apparently spent 20 years trying not to think about too closely. She wrote that she was a mother herself now, to a daughter with a visible birthmark on her neck, and that watching her own child navigate the same kind of stairs Emma must have grown up with, had forced her, finally, to reckon honestly with the fourth grader she'd once been. "I think about that birthday party more than you'd believe," the message read. "I was cruel to you because I was scared of being different myself, and it was easier to make sure someone else felt smaller than me. I don't expect you to respond to this. I just needed you to know. I know what I did, and I'm sorry. All these years too late to matter." Emma read the message twice, then set her phone down on the counter and was quiet for a long time. "Are you going to respond?" I asked. She thought about it for several days before she did. When she finally wrote back, she kept it short, kind but not effusive, thanking Kayla for the honesty and telling her simply that the best way to make the apology mean something now was to make sure her own daughter never once felt the kind of loneliness Emma had felt at that age. "I don't need you to carry this forever," Emma wrote. "I've mostly set it down myself, but I hope your daughter grows up in a world with more people like the person you're describing wanting to be now, and fewer like the girl you were at that party." Kayla never wrote back after that, and Emma never expected her to. "Some apologies," she told me afterward, "aren't really asking for a relationship to be rebuilt. They're just asking permission to stop carrying something alone." I think I gave her that. That felt like enough. The New York show, when it finally came, was smaller in scale than either Portland or San Francisco. Emma was included as one of 11 emerging artists in a group exhibition at a well-regarded Chelsea gallery rather than the sole featured name, but it carried a different kind of weight for both of us, simply because of how far it felt from where we'd started. We stayed in a cramped hotel room that cost more per night than either of us was entirely comfortable admitting out loud, and Emma spent the morning of the opening pacing the small room, rehearsing answers to questions she was terrified a New York audience might ask that a Seattle or Portland crowd hadn't yet thought to. "What if they ask about technique?" she said, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. "What if they want to know about my training, my influences, all the things I don't actually have a polished answer for?" I sat down beside her. "Then tell them the truth," I said. "Tell them your training was watching your grandmother mix watercolors at a kitchen table in a house 2 towns over, and that your only real influence was learning, the hard way, how to look closely at people the rest of the world looked past." She did, more or less, exactly that. When a critic from a well-known arts publication asked her precisely that question later that evening, standing in front of a portrait of an elderly couple on a porch swing, he wrote about her answer in his eventual review, calling it refreshingly unpretentious, in a scene often overrun with theory-heavy artist statements. That single line, more than any sale from that show, was the moment Emma finally let herself believe that not fitting the traditional mold of a trained artist might be a strength, rather than a liability she needed to apologize for. Not everything that came out of Emma's growing recognition was welcome, and I think it would be dishonest to leave out the hardest part of those 2 years, the one that had nothing to do with rumors or rivals, and everything to do with the wound that had started this whole story in the first place. About 8 months after the Portland show, a letter arrived at the gallery, forwarded to us by Olivia's office with a short note attached explaining that it had come through their general inquiries address. It was from Emma's mother, Denise. I'd never met her. Emma had spoken of her perhaps a dozen times in all the years we'd been together. Always briefly, always with a careful flatness that told me more than the words themselves ever did. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, and Emma read it standing at our kitchen counter with her coat still on, having not even set down her keys yet. I watched her face while she read it, and when she finished, she set it down without a word and walked out onto the balcony, the same balcony where she'd sat in silence for weeks after her grandmother died. I gave her 20 minutes before I followed her out. "She wants to see me," Emma finally said, staring out at the city lights. "She says she's proud of me. She says she always knew I had something special, that she just didn't know how to bring it out of me the way Evelyn did." I didn't say anything right away, because I didn't yet know which version of Emma needed to hear from me in that moment. The version that might want permission to be angry, or the version that might want permission to forgive. "Do you believe her?" I finally asked. Emma was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she said. "I think some part of her probably always did love me, in whatever limited way she was capable of. But I also think it's easier to love a daughter people are writing magazine articles about. than it was to love a 9-year-old with a new scar on her face and a school full of kids who wouldn't sit next to her. She didn't respond to the letter for almost a month. When she finally did, she agreed to meet her mother, once, at a coffee shop of Emma's choosing, on Emma's terms, with clear boundaries she'd written out in advance, almost like a legal document, which struck me as both heartbreaking and entirely sensible given everything I knew. I offered to come with her. She asked me to wait in the car instead, parked outside, visible through the window if she needed me, but present in a way that let her have this conversation as her own person, rather than as half of a couple. She was in there for 40 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her shoulders were steady in a way I recognized from every other hard thing she'd ever walked through. "How did it go?" I asked, as she climbed into the passenger seat. She was quiet for the first few blocks. "She apologized," Emma finally said. "Really apologized. Not the kind with an excuse folded into it. She asked if we could try to build something now, slowly. No promises, just trying." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was willing to try slowly too," Emma said. "But that trying doesn't erase 18 years, and it doesn't mean I need her approval anymore to know I'm enough. I already know that now. I just think maybe I'd like to have a mother in my life again. Even a complicated one. More than I'd like to keep being right about how much she hurt me." They've built something small and careful in the years since. Occasional dinners, a phone call every few weeks. Nothing like the relationship Emma has with the memory of her grandmother, and Emma has never pretended otherwise. But it's real, in its limited way, and I've come to admire that particular kind of strength in Emma more than almost anything else about her, the capacity to hold both, the truth of how badly someone failed her and the possibility that people can still, imperfectly, try to do better, without needing either truth to cancel out the other. Somewhere in the middle of those 2 years, quietly, without any single dramatic turning point, my own life reorganized itself around Emma's growing career. And I want to be honest that it wasn't always an easy adjustment, even though I never once resented it. I'd spent almost a decade defining myself primarily as a software engineer, proud of the steady, logical, unglamorous work of building things that functioned correctly. And there was an adjustment period, longer than I expected, in learning to become the person who managed contracts and shipping logistics and gallery correspondence for someone else's art career instead. I remember the exact conversation where we decided I'd leave the tech company entirely. It was after the New York show, when the volume of inquiries, sales, and scheduling had become more than either of us could handle around my full-time job. Emma sat across from me at our kitchen table one evening, the same table where I'd once shown her the online comments about her paintings, and asked, carefully, whether I'd be willing to consider it. "I don't want you to feel like you're disappearing into my career," she said. "That's not what any of this is supposed to be." I thought about it for a few days before answering, turning over 8 years of identity built around a job title I was, if I'm honest, only ever moderately passionate about in the first place. I realized, somewhere in that thinking, that I'd never once felt as genuinely alive watching a piece of code deploy successfully as I felt watching Emma's face the night that first exhibition sold out completely. "I'm not disappearing into your career," I finally told her. "I'm choosing to build something with you, instead of building something next to you. There's a difference, and I think I've been waiting my whole adult life to find out what the difference actually felt like." It wasn't glamorous work, managing an artist's business affairs. Endless emails with shipping companies about climate-controlled crating, tedious contract negotiations with galleries, tax paperwork that took entire weekends to sort through properly. But I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, a genuine satisfaction in it, the quiet pride of being the invisible infrastructure that let Emma's visible talent actually reach the people it was meant to reach. My father built things with his hands his whole life, and never once needed anyone to notice. I think some of that finally found its way into me, years after he was gone. We also, during that stretch, finally let ourselves start talking seriously about the family we wanted to build, beyond just the two of us. Emma had always been quietly nervous about the idea of children, worried in ways she rarely said aloud that she might somehow pass along the same vulnerability to unkindness that had shaped so much of her own childhood. We talked about it late one night on that same balcony where she'd once sat in silent grief after her grandmother's death, now repainted, now filled with potted plants Emma had started keeping alive against all odds. "What if our kid gets bullied the way I did?" she asked me quietly. What if I can't protect them from what I couldn't protect myself from? I took her hand. Then they'll have something you didn't have at that age, I told her. They'll have a mother who already knows exactly what that pain looks like, and exactly how to sit beside them in it, instead of pretending it isn't happening. We welcomed our daughter, Evelyn, named for the grandmother who had shaped Emma into the woman I fell in love with, about a year and a half after the gala. She has her mother's steady, watchful eyes, and so far, thankfully, none of her mother's scars, though I've promised myself, the way I imagine every parent eventually promises themselves something similar, that if the day ever comes when the world tries to tell her she isn't enough for some reason entirely outside her control, she will never once wonder whether her family is in her corner. The first time Emma brought our daughter to visit her grandmother's grave, Evelyn was barely 8 months old, too young to understand any of it. Bundled against the autumn cold in a stroller, Emma insisted on pushing herself across the uneven cemetery grass. Emma knelt down at the headstone for a long while, one hand resting on the cool granite, the other resting on our daughter's small foot. I brought her to meet you, Emma said quietly, to the grave, to the grandmother who had taught her that painting doesn't care what your face looks like. It only cares what your hands can do. Her name is Evelyn. I hope that's all right. I stood a respectful distance away, the way I usually did during these visits, letting Emma have her conversation uninterrupted. When she finally stood back up, wiping her eyes, she looked down at our daughter, and then back at the headstone. She's going to know your name before she knows almost anything else, Emma said. She's going to know exactly who built the foundation everything else got to stand on. I promise you that. 2 years after the gala, almost exactly 5 years to the week after our small, quiet wedding, that so many people had once treated as a punchline, Rachel invited us to Thanksgiving at her house. It wasn't the first holiday we'd spent with my extended family since the gala. Rachel had worked hard, genuinely hard, in the years since her apology, showing up for Emma in small, consistent ways that meant more to me than any single grand gesture could have. But this particular Thanksgiving was different, because for the first time since our wedding, my uncle would be there. The same uncle who had spent our entire engagement dinner asking me about my career, instead of speaking a single word to my fiancée. And so would the cousin who had asked, in front of the whole table, "So what exactly happened to your face?" I'll admit I was tense walking up Rachel's front steps that afternoon, Emma's hand in mine, our 18-month-old daughter balanced on my hip, a bottle of wine, and one of her smaller finished canvases, a gift for Rachel, a quiet portrait of our parents she'd worked from an old photograph, tucked under my other arm. Emma, characteristically, was calmer than I was. "Whatever happens," she told me on the porch, "I'm not the same person I was at that dinner 5 years ago. And honestly, Daniel, neither are they. People change. Let's give them the chance to prove it before we assume they haven't." The house was warm and loud in the particular chaotic way of a large family holiday, and for the first 20 minutes, nothing remarkable happened at all, just cousins catching up, my uncle carving the turkey badly and complaining about it loudly, the ordinary noise of people who share blood but not always much else. Rachel was the first to reach us at the door, and she went straight past me to Emma, wrapping her arms around both Emma and the baby at once. "She's beautiful," Rachel whispered, brushing a gentle hand over our daughter's dark hair. "What's her name?" "Evelyn," Emma said. After my grandmother. Rachel's eyes filled with tears for the second time in this story, though this time there was nothing but warmth in them. "Can I hold her?" she asked. And Emma, without hesitation, handed our daughter into my sister's arms, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier and now felt as natural as breathing. Watching Rachel rock my daughter gently in the front hallway of her own home, I understood that whatever had broken between us at that engagement dinner all those years ago had, slowly and deliberately, been rebuilt into something sturdier than what came before it. Then my uncle, drink in hand, wandered over to the corner of the living room where Rachel had hung 2 of Emma's paintings, gifts from previous years, and stood there for a long moment studying them. "These are incredible," he said, not realizing at first that Emma was standing close enough to hear him. "Rachel, where did you find this artist?" Rachel, setting down a serving dish, smiled in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. "That's Emma's," she said simply. "My sister-in-law painted those." My uncle turned around slowly. He looked at Emma for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. Some old, lazy assumption finally, belatedly collapsing under the weight of an actual fact standing right in front of him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I had no idea you painted." "You never asked," Emma said. Not unkindly, just honestly. The way she said almost everything. He didn't have a response to that. He simply nodded, looked back at the paintings, and said, "They're really something, Emma. I mean that." My cousin, the one who had asked about her scar at the engagement dinner all those years ago, approached us later in the evening, considerably more awkward than my uncle had managed to be. He'd clearly heard, secondhand through the family grapevine over the years, some version of everything that had happened. The exhibitions, the gala, the People's Choice Award, the magazine feature that had run the previous spring. He stood in front of us for a moment, visibly working up the nerve to say something, and finally landed on, "I saw the article about you in that Seattle magazine. That's really impressive, Emma." "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm sorry," he added, quieter now, glancing briefly at the faint scar on her cheek before meeting her eyes properly, maybe for the first time in 5 years. "About what I said at the dinner. I was young and stupid, and I didn't think before I opened my mouth." Emma studied him for a moment, and I watched her decide, the way she always seemed to decide things, to extend the same grace she'd offered Rachel at the gala. "It's all right," she said. "I'd rather you notice the paintings now than never notice them at all." I ran into Marcus, of all people, purely by accident, about a month after that Thanksgiving. I'd left the tech company 2 years earlier to manage Emma's growing business affairs full-time, and I hadn't crossed paths with anyone from my old office in a long while. I saw him at a coffee shop downtown, and he saw me too, and for a moment I genuinely considered pretending I hadn't. Instead, he walked over. "Daniel," he said, looking almost sheepish, which was not an expression I associated with Marcus Feld. "I heard about your wife, the painter. My sister actually has one of her prints hanging in her apartment. She had no idea it was, her." I didn't say anything for a moment. Just let him sit with the discomfort of the memory I knew he was circling. "I was a jerk back then," he finally said. "About the photo. At your wedding. I think about it sometimes, honestly, more than you'd probably guess. I judged someone I'd never met off a picture, and I was completely wrong, and the worst part is, I wasn't even a little bit sorry about it at the time." "Are you sorry now?" I asked, not unkindly, genuinely curious. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I am. I've got a daughter now. 2 years old. I think about the idea of some guy at a bar someday laughing at a picture of her for looking a certain way, and it makes me want to throw up, honestly. I didn't used to think about consequences like that. I do now." I told him simply that Emma didn't need his guilt, but that if he meant it, the kindest thing he could do with it now was to be a different kind of person going forward, especially for that daughter. He nodded slowly, like he was actually taking it in rather than just performing contrition to make himself feel better, and we shook hands and went our separate ways. I never mentioned it to Emma. Some apologies, I've learned, matter more to the person offering them than to the person who was wronged, and I didn't need her to carry the weight of managing his redemption on top of everything else she'd already carried alone for so many years. Marcus mentioned, almost as an afterthought before we parted ways that day, that Priya, the coworker who'd stayed quiet at that first lunch all those years ago, had actually attended one of Emma's Portland shows on her own, without ever telling either of us she'd gone. I found that strange information to sit with. I'd always privately thought of Priya's silence at that lunch as a small, insufficient kindness. Better than active cruelty, but still a kind of complicity through inaction. Learning that she'd quietly followed Emma's career in the years since, enough to travel for a gallery show she had no professional reason to attend, made me reconsider that judgment. Not everyone who fails to speak up in a difficult moment is indifferent. Sometimes, they're simply still working out, slowly and privately, exactly where they stand, and it takes years rather than minutes for that internal reckoning to finish. I never did track her down to ask about it directly. Some stories, I've come to believe, are allowed to stay a little unfinished, a small loose thread in an otherwise mostly resolved life. Later that night, as we drove home under a sky heavy with the first snow of the season, Emma rested her head against the passenger window and was quiet for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. 5 years ago," she said, "I stood in a room exactly like that one and felt invisible. Worse than invisible. like something people had to politely tolerate. Tonight, I stood in a room, and people who used to look through me were asking to hear my thoughts on brushwork. I reached over and took her hand. "Does it feel good?" She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about most things. "It feels strange," she finally said, "because none of it changes what happened. It doesn't erase the years I spent believing I wasn't enough. But I think," she added slowly, "it proves something I needed to see with my own eyes instead of just believing because you told me. It proves the people who were wrong about me were always going to be wrong, whether or not I ever painted a single canvas. The paintings didn't make me worth loving, Daniel. They just finally made everyone else able to see what you saw from the very beginning." I didn't have anything to add to that. I just held her hand the rest of the way home, snow gathering softly on the windshield. 5 years of the hardest and best chapter of my life quietly closing behind us like a door finally, gently, shutting out the cold. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, on an ordinary gray Saturday with nothing in particular planned, Emma asked if I'd drive her back to the old library branch, where we'd first met. She hadn't been back inside since the day she resigned. I hadn't been back either, not really having a reason to. The building looked almost exactly the same tired brick exterior, the same slightly crooked sign out front that the city kept promising to replace. Inside, most of the staff had changed over in the years since. Perry Caulfield, long gone, as we already knew. But the corner where I'd first seen Emma reading, where she'd laughed softly helping a little boy pick up a stack of fallen books, was untouched. The same worn armchair still sitting in the same patch of window light. Emma stood in that corner for a long moment, our daughter asleep against my shoulder, and I watched her take in the space with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, and not simple nostalgia either. "I used to sit right here," she said quietly, "and tell myself this was probably as good as my life was going to get. A quiet job, a quiet corner. People who were polite to me because they had to be. I didn't let myself want more than that, because wanting more than that felt like setting myself up to be disappointed by people, the way I'd already been disappointed so many times before." I came over and stood beside her. "And now?" I asked. She looked around the library once more, then up at me, then down at our sleeping daughter. "Now I know that corner was never the ceiling," she said. "It was just where I was standing, the day someone finally noticed there was a whole life waiting past it." We didn't stay long. There wasn't a dramatic scene, no former colleague materializing to complete some tidy narrative arc, just two people and a sleeping toddler standing quietly in a familiar corner of a public library on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon. "But it felt important to go back," Emma told me on the drive home. "Important to stand in the exact place where the old version of her life had ended, and the new one had first, quietly, without either of us realizing it yet, begun. It's been almost a year since that Thanksgiving now, and I'm writing this down finally, because Emma asked me to. She's never wanted her story told as a triumphant fairy tale, all struggle neatly resolved into a happy ending, and I want to honor that by telling you honestly what our life actually looks like now, 5 years and some months after that quiet beach proposal nobody thought would last. Emma still paints every day, though the studio has grown considerably since that first cramped garage setup. We bought a small house last year, modest by the standards of some of her wealthier collectors, but it has a converted sunroom with north-facing light that she says is the best studio she's ever worked in. She still gets nervous before every opening. She still, occasionally, catches herself starting to apologize for taking up space in a room, an old habit built from 18 years of practice, though she catches it faster now, and stops herself sooner. Olivia Bennett still represents her, and the two of them have become genuine friends over the years, not just business partners, the kind of friendship built on mutual respect, rather than proximity. Just last spring, a regional museum acquired one of her early portraits, the very one of the elderly man's folded hands that had first stopped Josephine Atta in her tracks at that modest downtown gallery. All those years ago, Josephine, now in her 80s, had generously donated it back specifically so it could hang somewhere the public could see it permanently, rather than in her own private collection. Emma cried when she got the call, the same way she'd cried the night that first exhibition sold out, and I understood, watching her, that some victories never fully lose their power to surprise you, no matter how many times life proves you deserve them. Rachel and Emma talk on the phone most weeks now. They've built something neither of them could have imagined at that engagement dinner 5 years ago. Something slow and ordinary and real. The kind of relationship built not from grand apologies alone but from years of small, consistent choices to keep showing up. Our daughter Evelyn calls her Aunt Rachel with the same easy affection she uses for everyone she loves, with no memory at all of the version of the family that once existed before the apology, which strikes me sometimes as its own quiet kind of grace, that a child can simply inherit the repaired version of a relationship without ever needing to carry the weight of what it took to repair it. I've watched Emma's actual process closely enough, over enough years now, to describe it in a way I couldn't have when we first met, back when I only knew that her sketchbook portraits moved me without fully understanding why. She never works from imagination alone. Every single piece begins with hours of simply watching her subject, in person whenever possible, memorizing the particular way a person's hands rest when they think no one's paying attention, the specific asymmetry of a real smile versus a posed one. She told me once that most people, when asked to sit for a portrait, instinctively arrange their face into the version they think looks best, and that her entire job as a painter is learning to see past that arrangement to whatever's underneath it. I think that's the real reason her work affects people the way it does. She spent 18 years of her own life being reduced to a single surface detail, a scar people couldn't look past, and it made her almost supernaturally attentive to everything underneath a person's surface in return. She paints the parts of people the rest of the world is too impatient or too cruel to bother looking for. I think about my parents often, more than I expected to at this stage of my life. My father never met Emma, never got to see the woman I chose, or the granddaughter who carries her great-grandmother's name. My mother never got to hear Emma play the small second-hand piano we eventually bought for our living room, badly, cheerfully, the same way I imagine my mother once played badly and cheerfully before decades of practice made her genuinely gifted. I used to feel that absence as a kind of wound, a permanent gap in the story. I've come to feel it differently now, less as a wound and more as an inheritance, the values they raised me with, about character mattering more than appearance, about kindness outlasting cruelty, quietly working their way through me into a marriage and a daughter they never got to meet, but somehow still helped build. I keep a small framed photograph on my desk now, one I look at more often than I probably should during a normal workday, my father in his shop apron, my mother at her piano, and beside it, a photograph Emma took of the two of us on our wedding day, the four of us never in the same room together in real life but somehow, in that small arrangement of frames, finally sharing the same space. Rachel noticed it once, during a visit, and asked me gently whether it made me sad, keeping them so close together like that. It used to, I told her. Now, it mostly makes me grateful. I think they'd have loved her, Rachel. I think Dad would have taught her how to stretch a canvas properly, instead of buying the pre-stretched kind from the craft store. And I think Mom would have insisted on teaching Evelyn piano the second she could reach the keys, whether Emma and I were ready for that particular chaos or not. Rachel laughed. And for a moment, standing in my kitchen 5 years and a whole education in humility after that terrible engagement dinner, it felt like we were simply a family again, ordinary and imperfect and finally, mercifully, honest with one another. Most days, our life looks nothing like the version I've just spent so many pages describing. No galas, no headlines, no dramatic confrontations. Most days look like Tuesday. I make coffee while Emma gets Evelyn dressed, badly, since our daughter has recently developed strong and entirely non-negotiable opinions about which socks are acceptable. Emma disappears into the sunroom studio for a few hours, while I handle emails and shipping logistics at the kitchen table. We eat dinner together most nights, the three of us, at a table considerably nicer than the one in our first cramped apartment, though I sometimes find myself missing that apartment anyway. The particular scrappy hopefulness of two people building something out of almost nothing. In the evenings, Emma reads to Evelyn from the same battered picture books she once read to strangers' children at a church basement 2 bus transfers away, and I stand in the doorway. Sometimes, the way I used to stand in the doorway of the garage studio, watching without either of them noticing, because those are still, after everything, the moments when I love my life the most. Emma asked me once, not long ago, sitting on our back porch watching Evelyn chase a moth across the grass in the last light of a summer evening, whether I ever regretted marrying someone who came with so much difficulty attached. The family rejection, the years of struggle, the plagiarism scandal that nearly derailed everything, the complicated relationship with her own mother that still requires careful tending. I looked at her for a long moment before answering, thinking about the girl I first saw sitting alone in a corner of the library, laughing softly as she helped a little boy pick up a stack of fallen books. "Emma," I told her, "I didn't marry difficulty. I married you. The difficulty was never yours. It belonged entirely to the people too small to see what was standing right in front of them." She didn't say anything to that. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, the same way she had on that quiet beach 5 years earlier, and we sat there together, watching our daughter chase moths in the fading light, two people who had built, slowly and deliberately, out of rejection and grief and stubborn belief, exactly the kind of life neither of us had ever quite dared to imagine we deserved. 5 years earlier, people couldn't believe I had married Emma. Now, they couldn't believe they had ever underestimated her. And that's when I finally understood something my parents had taught me long ago. Beauty fades. Money comes and goes. Popularity changes overnight. But character? Character has the power to change lives forever. And the people who mock what they don't understand rarely get a second chance to see how wrong they were. But when they do, when the room finally goes quiet, and every doubting face turns toward the person they once dismissed, there is no sound in the world quite like it. If somewhere in this story, you recognized a version of yourself, the person everyone underestimated, the person who was told to expect less, the person still waiting for the world to look past the surface and finally notice what was underneath, I hope you'll hold on to Emma's grandmother's words the same way Emma always has. It only cares what your hands can do. Keep building. The right people are already on their way to notice, even if they haven't arrived yet. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you longest. And if you know someone who's ever been made to feel like they weren't enough, maybe send this their way. Sometimes the smallest reminder that someone, somewhere sees your worth is exactly the thing that helps a person keep going until the rest of the world finally catches